Helen Pearson believes the police missed repeated opportunities to prevent the attack which could have taken her life. In the culmination of a 5-year campaign of stalking, she was set upon and stabbed 8 times with a pair of scissors.
I remember a big side one on the side to my nose like that. And I just remember that when I looked at his face and that realisation of who it was, who I suspected, I was shot, and I remember pleading, no, please no, and it was like it gave him more strength to carry on.
If you love this podcast, I'm sure you're looking for other great true crime podcasts to listen to. Wondery, the network behind this show, has other podcasts for you, especially if you love the way we tell stories here on Real Crime Profile. Great shows like Best Case, Worst Case, Locked Up Abroad, and Hollywood and Crime. All of them are amazing storytellers that you're going to love. So if you're looking for more variation in your podcast like true crime, entertainment, or audio dramas, they're all available from Wondery. Just head to apple.co/Wondery. That's apple.co/Wondery. Or if you're an Android user, head to Wondery.fm.
Helen has revealed details of her ordeal to us, as she believes stalking isn't taken seriously enough by the police. Altogether, 125 attacks on her and her family were logged by the police. The family had evidence Willis was the stalker, but the police did not catch him, despite Helen's repeatedly desperate pleas.
I don't know where I'm being followed. You don't know whether your friends are going to get targeted, what's going to happen. Every night you go to bed, you don't know whether it's going to be a broken window. You don't know what's going to happen. You just constantly live in fear.
Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. I'm Laura Richards, former New Scotland Yard, criminal behavioural analyst and founder of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service. And with me today is
Rachel Horman, lawyer and chair of Paladin.
So Rachel, it's really great to be able to speak with you today, and it's the beginning of National Stalking Awareness Week, so I know your time is super busy. There's an event at the House of Lords.
Yes.
And of course we all want to make sure that there's clear messages about the risks and dangers of stalking. So tell our listeners a little bit about the work that you do on a day-to-day basis and Paladin.
Okay, so I'm a specialist lawyer. I specialise in stalking and domestic abuse cases. I've done this type of work for over 20 years now. And I was working this out recently. I think I've represented over 10,000 victims in that time, mostly women, all of whom have been affected by domestic abuse, coercive control, or stalking, and sometimes all three, unfortunately. I've also been involved with a fantastic organisation that you set up, Paladin, National Stalking Advocacy Service. It's the only organisation of its type in the world. We do some fantastic work, and this week we are going to be showcasing some of the work we do. This evening we have an event at the House of Lords to celebrate the fantastic work that Paladin do on a daily basis, helping victims who, in the majority of cases, are being failed by the criminal justice system, unfortunately.
Now, you'll recall that at our first national Best Practice Conference, which was last year on June 29th, 2017, that sadly there was the murder of young Molly McLaren. Again, another female who went into the police and had told them that she was being stalked and was terrified that he would end up killing her. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And such a travesty. We actually covered it in one of our more recent episodes. And today, to mark the start of National Stalking Awareness Week, we also had Clive Ruggles, who you met as well, who just is incredible and inspirational in not just what happened to him and his family, but in explaining the learning of what needs to change. So we keep seeing the same patterns, don't we, over and over?
Yes, I mean, the cases are so similar, and almost it feels like every day when I open up the paper, there seems to be another case of mainly women who have clearly been stalked for a long time, women that have been to the police and reported incidents of stalking, have reported to the police, I think he's going to kill me, he's going to do something. And in the vast majority of cases, the police do nothing or not enough. And every time there will be an inquiry after the woman has been murdered, generally having their throats cut, it seems to be, by the perpetrator. And it just seems that the same lessons aren't being learnt. At the end of the inquiry, the police will always say, "We apologise, it's a tragic incident, we will learn from this," and nobody learns, and it happens again and again and again. And 2 women a week are still being murdered by ex-partners, and that statistic isn't changing. Yet there's more and more money being invested into this sector. The police in particular, the Crown Prosecution Service, even the judiciary just still do not understand domestic abuse, still do not understand stalking. And until they do, women will continue to be slain by men.
That's why we call these cases murder in slow motion. And, it is frustrating. And certainly with Alice, you'll recall that the police officer actually said that it was harassment, and his advice to her was to get an injunction. What's your view on that?
Well, I specialise in obtaining injunctions precisely because the police aren't doing their job, and I shouldn't need to be helping victims get injunctions at all. That part of my job should be completely redundant, and I wish it was. To me, it's just lazy policing, the police not understanding the risk and not seeing the behaviour for what it is. It's stalking, and in that case, the police actually said to Alice on the telephone, "What do you want us to do about it?" Alice was then murdered by her ex-partner. That shouldn't have happened. The signs were there, and unfortunately there was a lot of publicity given to Alice's case, as there often are after the event of a murder. But I still have clients coming into my office every day saying that the police are still saying that to them. "What do you want us to do about it?" Because they look at the incident in isolation and they do not, as you always say, join the dots. They don't join them together and see the impact of the stalking and the risk and the fixation and the obsession, which is what characterises stalking. Therefore, they miss the risk and they just allow victims to be murdered.
So what would be some of the key practice points or advice that you would give? If one of our listeners right now is in that very same situation, perhaps has called the police and they say, well, it might be harassment, or let's get a police information notice, these pins. What would be your advice to any of our listeners in that current situation?
Well, pins should not be being given police information notices. There was a recent investigation into the whole practice of how the police and the CPS investigate and deal with stalking and harassment. The HMIC reports last year. And
so that's our Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and also Her Majesty's of the Inspectorate for the Crown Prosecution Service. It was a joint inspection, thematically looking at both.
The police and the lawyers.
6 areas, didn't it, in particular?
And one of the conclusions from that inquiry, and there were many, was that pins should be abolished straight away. And the reason for that is that when they looked at that issue and they looked at, lots and lots of cases where pins had been issued, in virtually every single case, the pin should not have been issued or was issued incorrectly. And the conclusion was that that was putting victims at risk. And unfortunately, notwithstanding that report, the police are still issuing pins on a daily basis. And, it's like banging your head against the wall, really. I don't know how many times the police need to hear these messages or how many women need to lose their lives before somebody starts to do things differently.
Yeah, and the pin is, I explained it on the last pod that actually dropped today with Clive, it is a piece of paper. And no piece of paper, be it an injunction, a restraining order, or even a police information notice, will keep a victim safe or deter a fixated and obsessed individual. And that is an incredibly frustrating, but it's also dangerous practice.
Very.
Because victims can be lulled into a false sense of security, right? And you see this every day, as do I, where victims believe, well, the police know what they're doing. They know,
Yeah.
this particular area. They're the experts. And if they're saying this is what I should do, and
Yeah.
if you're polite, like Molly and
Yeah.
Alice or Shana Grice in Sussex, then you acquiesce in the face of an authority figure.
Yeah, it's a bit like challenging your GP, isn't it? You just don't do it because you see them as the expert and you trust them. But in that report, they looked at 270 cases of pins being issued, and virtually every one was incorrect. I have cases where pins are given and then the perpetrator ups the ante and will then perhaps start being physically violent against the victim where perhaps they hadn't before, because it can provoke the perpetrator. And so many victims believe that a pin is actually some kind of protective order, and it's absolutely nothing. It's just the police saying to the perpetrator, don't do that, but there are no consequences for breaking it. And unfortunately, I've seen cases where there have been multiple pins issued. So I've had a case where 3 pins were issued in respect of the same victim, the same perpetrator. And as you will know, Laura, the test for a prosecution for stalking is only 2 incidents. So why wasn't there a prosecution? And generally what I find in these cases is that a prosecution could have been taken very quickly upon the first report being made, because the other thing that we know in these cases is that a victim will have suffered on average 100 incidents before they even go to the police. So when the police say, come back when he hits you, or come back when he does something else, it just demonstrates really they're not interested in helping women protect themselves from being stalked and, unfortunately, in many cases, murdered.
Yes, and that point that 77% of victims have been stalked over 100 times before they even call the police. I mean, that's before they even call the police.
Yeah.
So the fact that stalking became a crime in 2012 and you need 2 behaviours,
Yeah.
asking somebody, well, what do you want us to do at the time when they're calling the police because they're fearful and they're terrified is completely inappropriate. And what was alarming about the HMIC and CPSI, the inspection, and our listeners can Google it and you can find it online, is that within the 6 regions that were inspected, there was 100% failure rate.
Yeah. And that didn't surprise me at all. This was the first inspection there's ever been. And I know that Paladin were involved in speaking to some of the officers involved in the inspection.
And we lobbied for it.
Yeah.
We lobbied the Chief Officer, Gary Shewan, for this inspection to take place because
Yeah.
we know through
we knew what
clients-
was happening. We could see this happening on a daily basis, of course. So the report wasn't a surprise to us at all. If it had been different, I would have been extremely shocked. What I'm waiting to see is the changes, and I haven't seen any since that report, unfortunately.
And that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Because, as I said on the last pod with Clive Ruggles, it comes down to leadership.
Yeah, an attitude. And I honestly think that the police, the CPS, just aren't interested and don't want to improve their practice because there can be no other reason. We see victims being murdered on a daily basis, almost in exactly the same circumstances with the exact same risk factors happening, the murder in slow motion, and it happens again and again. And I have very serious cases where clients are reporting horrendous things happening to them, horrendous threats, weapons involved, all sorts of things, dead animals being left on their doorstep. And what are the police doing? Nothing.
Well, that sadly reminds me of the case of Helen Pearson when you talk about dead animals being left. And you'll recall Helen suffered across 5 years, and there were 144 calls to the police, and 2 weeks before he tried to kill her by stabbing her multiple times, he left a dead cat on her doorstep.
Huge risk factor, and you would think that would be obvious to anybody, that if that is happening, this is a scary case, this is somebody we need to look at, we've got a dangerous perpetrator. That is, to me, common sense. Unfortunately, it isn't seen as that. Helen had 144 incidents. They were the ones reported to the police. I'm quite sure there were many, many more that weren't reported to the police, but that just shows the length. And Helen didn't give up. She kept reporting. Her family supported her in doing that. A lot of victims, unfortunately, do give up reporting because when you're just rebuffed all the time by the police, told, what do you want us to do? This is not a crime. You're wasting our time. We're going to charge you with wasting police time. I've heard that. I've heard victims...
That happened in Shana Grice's case.
Yeah.
She was given a fixed penalty notice by Sussex Police.
And then was murdered. But again, these things are still happening. Lessons aren't being learnt at all. And things just need to change desperately. I just believe we need to hold the police, the criminal justice system to account. They need to be accountable in the same way that companies would be accountable for negligence, because to me this is negligence.
Yes, I guess when we look back across the journey, and certainly, the 20 years I've worked across law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and you understand that the knowledge improves, that you create best practice tools, you set up charities, and you've done fantastic work as the chair of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service. And I want to thank you for the time and your commitment in the leadership around Paladin. And we can set up services that help, but we must work with our partners, and we need them to raise their game. And our knowledge has improved, and so we can't say anymore, well, we didn't know, we didn't understand the research, that if a stalker, if they've had an intimate relationship with the victim, if they make a threat, 1 in 2 of them will act on it, 50%. Now, that information is something I've been promulgating in all training. And so, they can't say anymore, well, they didn't know, but it does come down to that investment in training. And that, again, goes back to leadership, to change attitudes and aptitude. When something is important, then it gets done. So is it the simple fact that you believe that perhaps, where violence against women and girls is concerned, that it's still just not seen as a priority, and because of the subject that it is it about misogyny or a patriarchal society? Why isn't this seen as important in your view?
Well, yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. That's exactly what I think. There can be no other explanation. As you say, you created Paladin because of the failings within the criminal justice system and the lack of knowledge around stalking and the risks and the connections that you saw with homicides on a regular basis. That information is out there. The police do know about it. The police have had training on it, and they will say they know and they've learnt the lessons, etc., and then just do the same thing time and time again. But if we look at what the police do with crimes like rape and domestic violence and child abuse, all of those crimes tend to affect women as victims much more disproportionately, with generally a male perpetrator. Then that's also the theme that we see with those crimes. They aren't invested in. The prosecution rate and conviction rate are extremely low in all of those crimes, yet those are the crimes that are repeat crimes, repeat perpetrators, happening daily on all the time, and victims are just being failed time and time again.
And with stalking, we see lots of different types of cases at Paladin, and I'm sure you do too, just in terms of your office. And I mentioned Helen Pearson because, of course, she didn't have a relationship with the stalker.
Yeah. And those type of cases, I think, are dealt with, dare I say, even worse than cases where there has been a connection with the stalker. The police are starting to make the links in terms of domestic abuse and risk. I say starting, they've still got a long way to go. But in terms of risk with strangers, they really do not have a clue, it seems. And that is an area where I think victims have to work the hardest to get the police to do anything. And in my experience, what victims have to do is pretty much investigate their own crime and almost prove it beyond reasonable doubt before the police will even pick up a pen to take a statement.
Right, and that's, even more challenging. And with Helen's case, he had asked her out on a date, but she had said no, that she didn't want to go. And that was the start of it all. And of course, there was much more time, energy and effort invested in trying to prove that she was making it up. And it was actually her father, who is a statistician at a university. He was keeping the diary, the time, date, stamp of all of the behaviours.
Yeah.
And that played even more into, you're unprotected, you're terrified. And I remember Helen distinctly saying, well, whenever I called the police, I would tell them this is linked to master crime, and then she would read out the full reference number. So it wasn't a case of systemic failure, the system wasn't joining it up. She was very clearly telling people it was the pattern of behaviour, and it was the same person doing it, but at no time did they try and investigate the things that she was saying, or even who she thought it might be.
Yeah, and unfortunately that's very common.
The stalking began with attacks on Helen's car, causing many thousands of pounds worth of damage. Its tyres were slashed and the bodywork scratched. Graffiti was daubed around the streets near her flat. And then there were the letters. I want to play a game. I want to see how you would cope if you were attacked. Would you fight back? Scream. Let the game begin. A dead cat was left on Helen's doorstep. And there were attacks on her flat, often in the middle of the night.
The police just don't want to know. And again, like you say, even when a victim perseveres with it, like Helen and her family did, the police still don't want to know. And actually, in that case, I wonder what would have happened had she not been so seriously physically attacked in that way. It may still be happening, unfortunately. I just think that the police do not see it as a serious crime, and they just think it's a woman being hysterical. What are you bothered about? It's only a bunch of flowers that he sent. It's only a dead cat. It's only some graffiti. It's only a threat. If he was going to do it, he would just do it. I still hear that. And as you say, 50% of domestic stalkers will carry out that threat. The police need to take it seriously. And unless victims do persevere, record it, pretty much investigate their own crime, obtain evidence, take photographs, all of that, the chances of the police doing anything are really low. And in my experience, actually, the chance of the police prosecuting you for wasting their time, because that's often how they see it, if they don't classify it as a stalking case, they just see you as a nuisance, mental health problems, wasting their time, possibly even will accuse you of stalking the perpetrator because you are making false allegations. I hear that a lot. And there can be nothing more frustrating as a victim than then to be accused of being the perpetrator yourself. It's just soul destroying for victims, and I don't know how they have the strength to then go on and pick the phone up the next day and report the next incident.
And is that something that you're seeing more and more, where, for example, and I've seen this in a number of cases where the victim then becomes hypervigilant, so they're looking online to see what the perpetrator may be doing, and then they're being told that, well, who's stalking who? Are you stalking the perpetrator? And therefore you're just as guilty of that behaviour. Yeah,
unfortunately I am hearing that, and it's outrageous. It really is. It's like saying don't look over your shoulder, basically. That's what they're saying. So if you hear the footsteps behind you, you don't look over your shoulder because you might be accused of doing something to the perpetrator. Of course, you are going to look online. Of course, if you think somebody is stalking you and they have a public social media page, of course you're going to look so that you can keep an eye on what they're saying about you, what their mood is. Don't forget, these victims will have experience of seeing their name and then a photograph of a gun or a photograph or a knife or something very, very threatening like that. So they are going to want to keep checking in on what's happening. They're doing, in a way, their own risk assessment. They shouldn't have to do that, and they wouldn't do that if the police would pull their finger out and actually do something to help the victim.
Right, and, as we always say, there are cases and cases. And these are the cases where people are most likely to be killed or where women and girls are. So there is serious risk and danger attached when somebody is fixated and obsessed.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned the threat, the 1 in 2, but if there's no relationship, i.e. in the Helen Pearson type cases, then it's 1 in 10.
Yeah, it's still high, isn't it?
It is. It's still a risk, and therefore, that phrase, and I've heard it so many times too. Well, if they were going to kill you, they would have done it by now. Well, we call them murder in slow motion for a reason, and Helen Pearson was 5 years, and then he acts. Now, this is a point, Rachel, I'm seeing time and time again about finality. Yeah, that it's a dynamic, it's a continuum, and risk is a dynamic process. So if you have finality, then that's what you need to understand, what's motivating the perpetrator's behaviour, but what's changed and what's the perpetrator trying to achieve from it. And if somebody's got nothing left to lose and they're at that final point, then this is where the catastrophic event can occur.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important that when a victim does report it to the police have to realise, well, hang on, they're reporting what sounds like stalking, because again, victims won't necessarily say that word. And whilst that word is now, thanks to the work you've done and Paladin, much more part of our vocabulary, unfortunately victims won't necessarily say that, and crimes are often recorded as criminal damage or malicious communications, etc. And again, it's just another way of selling the victim down the river, not seeing the behaviour for what it is and completely missing the risk. But when that happens, when that report is made, even if a victim doesn't call it stalking or harassment, the police should be able to make the links themselves to join up the dots and think, hang on, what they're reporting does sound like stalking here. Let's do a risk assessment. And if you do a risk assessment, a proper risk assessment, and you are trained to do the risk assessment, and I think they are important points that are often missed because most of the officers that do them aren't trained in it. But if you do that risk assessment, that will enable you to hopefully get from the victim better information, and the victim will start telling you about the 100 incidents that happened before she picked up the phone. And then the officer can do a proper investigation. Virtually every case I deal with now will involve some kind of online behaviour. And what that means is that there will be evidence there will be a digital footprint. And, that does mean that black and white evidence is there to be obtained by the police. But in the vast majority of the cases I deal with, the police don't want to know about that and don't seem to understand even how to go about that.
And, sometimes we will hear we can't prove it's them, we can't prove it's him.
Yeah.
What's your response to that, or your advice when police say, well, we just can't prove that it's them?
Well, generally what that means is you haven't proved it's them. In my experience, it means the police haven't lifted a finger in most cases to actually do what they're supposed to do and investigate the crime to find out who it is. And very little evidence there's very little evidence that I've seen that the police will actually invest time in doing that. And unless the victim can go with irrefutable evidence of who's done it and what they've done, then the police don't want to know.
And that's the key issue. I always say in training, and I'll be training Lincolnshire Police tomorrow, training all their single points of contact up there. And I say, if you don't ask any questions and if you don't investigate, you're right, you can't prove who it is. But that's ipso facto in any case, no matter what it is. If you don't do the legwork, if you don't ask the right questions, then you're not going to know what's going on. And you're certainly not going to be able to provide the evidence or find the evidence to prove the offence.
But that's the thing, and stalking is treated very, very differently to almost any other crime apart from domestic abuse, rape, sex abuse, etc. Where if you reported a burglary to the police, they wouldn't come out and say, well, you can't prove who's done it. They would investigate it. They wouldn't expect you to do anything other than just give a statement and cooperate with the police in their investigation. They wouldn't then say, well, we think we've got him. What we're going to do, we're going to warn him. We've had a word. We've told him not to do it again. They just wouldn't do that. They would prosecute straight away. You don't get a second chance like that. Yet with stalking, we're not talking about somebody stealing your TV. And, all right, you can be upset about a burglary, but, very unlikely are you going to be murdered because of a burglary. You're not going to lose your life in the majority of cases. Whereas with stalking, that is a real possibility. And if we think about how much it costs to investigate a murder, surely it makes economic sense, even if the criminal justice system do not care about women or victims. Then even if we just look at the money and the budgets, surely if you invest money in proper training and expect more from your officers and have penalties for those that don't, then at least you're going to save yourself some money as well as lives.
Yeah, certainly when I was running the homicide prevention unit at New Scotland Yard, I costed what it costs to investigate an average murder. Now, of course, there's no such thing as an average murder. And, in 2007, we'd costed it as £1.54 million. Now, that doesn't include the trial. That just includes the investigation. So I always say that RIP is reputation in pieces as well as rest in peace, because these cases that happen, and that figure doesn't include the, let's say it's 33 call-outs or 10 call-outs beforehand to the victim making the allegation of stalking or domestic violence. So actually it would be higher than that.
Or the lost work, because that victim may not have been able to go to work. So it's cost the company, if you like, money from that victim not turning up or not being productive. The victim will also probably be using the healthcare system a lot, because it does have a huge impact on a victim's mental health. So I think there are lots and lots of costs to this.
Well, and the post-traumatic stress disorder, we see very high levels. And it's why Paladin is a trauma-informed service, because every victim that we interact with has high levels of trauma.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the cost is huge, purely on a financial basis, and it's almost impossible to comprehend on an emotional and personal level for the victims and their families as well, because again, 21 people in addition to the victim will be directly affected by the stalking and the impact that has on them as well. So the ripple effect from this behaviour just goes on and on, yet nobody seems interested in actually solving this problem and nipping it in the bud when the victim first reports. And that's the key, that's when we have the opportunities, all of these missed chances that we have, that the police have, to save lives, and nobody seems to see that.
Well, we're certainly trying to help people understand it and use the right lens and ask the right questions, and that's why National Stalking Awareness Week, although it's only been around since 2011, I started it as a week rather than one day, because we really do need to keep people focused on the risks and dangers of stalking, but also that there is a piece of legislation that came in 2012 where two behaviours are required. And I'm afraid, my perspective is, Rachel, and I'll be interested to hear yours, when I keep hearing or seeing people say, it's a very difficult offence to prove. Well, my perspective is I do not believe it is a difficult offence to prove. It's the fact that people don't have the right attitude or aptitude and haven't been trained, and ergo believe it to be difficult to prove.
Absolutely. And again, what other crimes do they say that about? They don't say it about burglary. They say it about rape, don't they? And domestic abuse, child abuse. Again, crimes that affect women disproportionately. So,
but because it also has, sadly, there is the point that the stalker at some point will want to get up close and personal to the victim, because that's the whole point of it, that kind of intrusion into a victim's life. So there will be evidence of that happening. And that's what happened in Helen's case. He was actually going to her home address, and because she wasn't leaving her home, because she was so terrified, well, the simple act of putting a camera up would have shown him approaching the address. He was daubing her house, her apartment, in graffiti of Die, Helen, Die in 10-foot letters in white. and damaging her car, which was parked outside her apartment, over £9,000 worth of damage. And if just the simple thing of putting a camera up, that would have captured him and actually would have solved and saved not just money, but Helen from being stabbed multiple times, her very serious post-traumatic stress levels, which still go on to this day, even though he is in prison.
Yeah.
And so it's not a difficult offence to prove. Actually, there's very clear practical points that we wrote into the legislation. I'm a believer in being very pragmatic. And I sat down, I took a police officer in with me, Linda Dawson, to meet the Home Office lawyers, and we sat there and wrote the legislation with very clear practical points to prove for the police. So for me, there's no excuse. It is about the leadership and bringing in people like Rachel and Paladin and myself, and there are other experts in the field as well who can go out and train police. And, I listened very carefully to the findings from the HMIC report and some of the focus groups they ran with police officers. What police officers were saying, well, it's not legally defined. So stalking's not legally defined, so we don't know what it is, and therefore it's difficult to prove. What's your reaction to that?
Well, again, I think it's just an excuse, isn't it? I've heard the police say that myself. I see the police treat stalking as harassment or as criminal damage rather than stalking, when it's blindingly obvious that it is stalking. But what I would do is point anybody who is not sure what the definition of stalking should be to the Paladin website and to the definition that we use, which I think is an excellent definition and is common sense, really. And that is a pattern of unwanted, fixated and obsessive behaviour which is intrusive and causes fear of violence or serious alarm or distress. Now, that definition works hand in hand with the legislation that we have, because the legislation, as you will know, and I know this was your intention, doesn't require a threat. Now, this seems to be a fact that the police have, not cottoned onto at the moment, or even the lawyers that take the cases for the police, the CPS. And very often, again, victims are told, well, come back when he threatens you. And a threat isn't needed. And many victims of stalking will tell you that they don't need a threat to be made to be terrified. And it is just that constant invasion of their space. It's the first thing they think about in the morning, the last thing they think about at night. They are always looking over their shoulder, whether that be online or in actual fact. They are terrified by it. And again, that's why the legislation was drafted in that way, so that we can look at that distress to the victim and the impact that has onto the victim's day-to-day life. And that is one of the tests within the legislation. So again, what I would say to victims is, if you are being stalked, do not just record what's happening. Also record the effect of that behaviour on you. So it could be that you had to go to work a different way because you didn't want to pass, the guy at the bus stop. It could be that you actually couldn't face going into work. You didn't sleep the night before. You were too tired from all the stress. You're on antidepressants. You keep crying. You've fallen out with your partner. Whatever those effects may be, you've stopped going to the gym class you usually go to because you keep bumping into this guy on the way in. Make a record of that, because that in itself can make a difference in terms of which charge the police can bring. So it is really important to document the effect as well as the actual behaviour.
We have tried to raise the profile of Helen's case all the way through, and each time you get either a brush off or a say, yes, we'll review the case, followed by, we have done nothing wrong. And yet nobody could see in the police that the level of violence of one sort or another was rising and rising and rising. So it must be time to do something proactive. And so the complaint is really, why didn't they see what was happening and do something to stop Helen being attacked?
And they didn't seem to appreciate that the stalking incidents were getting worse. And we could see from the letters and things, from the dead cat that was left on the doorstep, this was typical of what a stalker does. And we were getting desperate. We were in fear.
I couldn't believe that the one authorities that you go to try and help in this weren't helping. I was shocked. I couldn't believe it.
And our listeners can find the diary template on the Paladin website. So we actually came up with a template to help people, and the key parts to the diary are, as Rachel said, the time, date, stamp of whatever's happening, but really important to document the impact on you, because that's the key aspect that we put within the legislation. The crime is defined by the impact that it has on the victim.
Yeah.
Now, that's why it's very different from the legislation in California, for example, where there is a piece of legislation that came in off the back of the Rebecca Schaefer stalking murder. Now, Rebecca was stalked and murdered by someone called Robert Bardeau, and she was sort of like a C-list celebrity who was on her way up to becoming, or an up-and-coming A-list celebrity. And unfortunately, she had somebody who was a fan, which is short for a fanatic, so there's a clue there, who wrote to her prolifically.
Yeah.
Now, her last movie, and we've talked about this case, and I use it in training, her last movie there was a love scene in it, and her fan believed that she had cheated on him because he was an erotomanic. He believed they were in a relationship and they would be together forever.
Yeah.
And so she cheated on him, and then he set about a course of behaviour to try and find her. And he hired a private detective, and he used the Department of Motor Vehicles, a DMV, to track her down. And he finds her in a hotel and he kills her. She opens the door and he kills her. Now, that case was prosecuted as a stalking murder by Marcia Clark, ironically, who we've talked about on the podcast, because she was also the prosecutor in the Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman case. So Marcia understood stalking. However, when the stalking legislation came in California, within the penal code, it is stipulated that there has to be a credible threat to kill. Now, that's a big problem, because we looked across to California and saw that in the penal code internationally and understood that it wasn't working, because it's a very subjective, who makes that determination? Who makes a determination that it's a credible threat to kill? Well, actually, in California, it's if it's reported to police, it will be LAPD. And they may or may not be trained to understand stalking, and they may or may not be experts in risk.
Yeah. And the victim generally will know whether it's credible, will certainly know better than the police, I would have thought, as to whether it's credible. But again, why should we have to wait until there is a threat to kill? This behaviour is serious before it gets to that point. And surely the purpose of legislation is to prevent cases escalating to where victims are being threatened, their lives are being threatened, because once you've got to that stage, it's going to be too late, I think, to do anything.
Yeah, and stalking by its nature, it's the insidious nature and the intrusive nature of it, that the threat is implied by the behaviour itself. And to give a nod to, having looked at a lot of cases and worked with a lot of victims, back in 2010, actually I think back in 2011, as we were running the first National Stalking Awareness Week and just gearing up for the stalking law reform campaign, there was a very important case, which was the case of Dr. Alison Hewitt, who was being stalked by someone called Al Amindala. And I fortunately came into contact with Alison at the time her case was going to court. Now, Alison had met him on a dating website. So this was one that she had paid a lot of money for, and unfortunately for her, she had been matched with a narcissistic psychopath. And so, dating sites do come with their own risks because of the pools that perpetrators will fish in. But she understood that there was something not quite right with him. Certainly after 6 months, he was trying to rush the relationship through very quickly. And it was, in fact, her mother and her grandmother who said to Alison on meeting him that they felt that there was something off with him, something left of centre, because he was so evasive.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to Alison's mother very early on, and after I'd spoken to Alison, and I was very intrigued as to why and how she had determined that Alan Mindala wasn't all he was cracked up to be. And she said, I knew a narcissistic psychopath, Laura, when I meet them, or when I met one. And I said, wow, what did you used to do in terms of your profession? 'Cause she told me she was retired, and she said, I'm a former probation officer.
Yeah.
And it was just incredible. I could tell instantly she'd worked in an area that had, where she'd come into contact with individuals, certainly those, who were narcissists. And I mean, the case itself is one that is incredibly alarming. Unfortunately, it ended well, but there were some very clear lessons that came out of it. So when Alison had said that she didn't want to continue the relationship, he then started a 4-month campaign of stalking her. And with that, he was breaking into her property. And at first, he refused to leave. And he'd keep going round there and turning up unannounced. And she'd called the police, I think it was about 4 times, because of this behaviour. But the tipping point came when he had broken into her flat and he had taken her ID and her medical certificate, because she's a medical doctor, and her passport. And she, at that point, understood that he meant her serious harm. And she calls the police. The police, fortunately, do take that seriously, and that in itself was a very good thing. And they were concerned for the safety of Alison and her mother and father. And when they were holidaying on Lundy Island, they got some information from the police that Alan Mindala may be on his way down to them, because he had been found in a field with crossbows and BB guns, and he'd been arrested and put before a magistrate's court down in Wiltshire. So they put them on alert. They actually airlifted them off of Lundy Island in the middle of the night, you'll recall.
Yeah.
And he had made his way back up to Lewis and had set fire to a police station. And then he disappeared. And fortunately, at this time, Alison was in a safe house with her parents. And what happened next was he appeared at the hospital that she was going to be doing her final exams, and where she was on the wards, and he'd managed to get his hands on a doctor's white coat and a stethoscope, and hung the stethoscope around his neck and tried to get access to the area that she was working. Unfortunately, the workplace did know that she was being stalked, thank goodness.
Yeah. So important to do that, isn't it?
To let people know.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, he did gain access. I've got the video footage of him actually, turning his back on the security doors and sort of acting as if he's carrying something and trying to get someone to open the doors. And unfortunately, they let him in. And as he's in there, I think it's one of the receptionists is watching his behaviour, and he's looking at the roster boards to see when she's due back on the ward. And I think this was it was early in the morning, something like 5:30, 6 o'clock, and she was actually due on at 6:30. And fortunately, someone had the presence of mind to follow him when he went into the toilet cubicles, and they blocked his exit. They actually put something against the door, and they called the police. And next the police arrive, they taser him, they cuff him, and they go down to the multi-storey car park where his van is, and they open the van, and he's converted the van, he's modified it so that it's a cage in the back, and there's a whole arsenal of torture implements ranging from knives to blowtorches. There's a map of a wooded area, which is where he intended to take her. And fortunately, Alison was safe. Now, he'd also tried to set fire to her mother's house too, so he'd intended risk to the police officers trying to protect her, to her parents, and to her, because he felt that Pam was getting in the way. And he's put before the court, Rachel, you'll recall, and he's charged with 9 counts. So 9 criminal offences, from criminal damage to arson, Section 2 harassment, Section 4 harassment. So Section 2 is putting someone in fear or alarm or distress, and the Section 4 is the more serious, in fear of violence. Now, when it goes to court, this is where it became an interesting case to watch, and where Alison and I linked up, because he was found guilty of 8 charges, excluding the one he wasn't found guilty of was the Section 4, putting her in fear of violence, which was absolutely staggering, because it's the reason why Section 4 harassment came in was for, you'll remember, the Tracy Morgan case. and for stalking specifically, and yet in this case he was found not guilty. Now the argument was that the van was found after the fact, i.e. that Alison didn't know that he had intended to kill her. He had never made the threat overtly to kill her. Ergo, the lawyers argued, how could she have been put in fear of violence?
Yeah.
And that is where it all fell down. So we proved that in our parliamentary inquiry, that because there was no articulated threat to kill, that's why he was found not guilty. And it's exactly the reason why Dr. Alison Hewitt became an ambassador for Paladin and supported myself and others, along with you, in the campaign to change the law on stalking and make it a specific criminal offence.
Yeah. I mean, that was a particularly terrifying case, wasn't it? I saw the pictures of the torture chamber in the back of his van and all the equipment. And it really is a wake-up call for anyone who needs it, that this is stalking, this is what can happen, and this is why we really need to take it serious. So when you recount it then, I've heard, the story and read about it many times, but I was mesmerised again as you were talking through it, and it sounds like a movie script. It really does. But this was happening to somebody, to Alison and her family, on a daily basis, and it must have been absolutely terrifying. And I'm sure that case and others like it are why we do what we do. That's what motivates us to go on and help victims. And in that case, you mentioned about the receptionist at the hospital who did notice his strange behaviour. What I would like to say about that is that we all know stalking when we see it, yet the police, in lots of cases, seem to be blind to it. And there just seems to be no excuse for that, because I think it is obvious what stalking is. And in my experience, there is always evidence there if we look for it.
Absolutely. And, Alison and Pam went on to become ambassadors for Paladin. They still speak out about this terrifying ordeal. And thank goodness for her mother, who did employ a private detective. And it was that evidence that was used that he had managed to find of the stalking behaviour and who Alan Mindala was. His violent history was actually in Canada. So that's where his history was, and he was allowed into the country. And so in this particular case, the family were awarded an amount of money because of the Home Office failings as well, of allowing him into the country. And Alison actually went on to write a book called Stalked. And I'd highly commend our listeners to read Alison's book. It really does read like a movie script, and these aren't extraordinary cases. No. These are the cases that we're working with and on, trying to keep victims safe day in, day out. And
again, another example of victim having to investigate their own crime by hiring a private detective.
Absolutely, and we hear about that more and more. And I think now we know through the research as well, and I'll just make a couple of points around some of the analysis of the domestic murder reviews, going back to some of my research and publication on DV homicides, is that 76% of them were happening on separation. So when someone leaves and stalking happens. Now, predominantly those cases had coercive control prior to separation, and it's on separation that it escalates, and then stalking, the very same behaviours, but they're called stalking, happen post-separation. And I published on that in 2003, and you'll recall a colleague of ours, Caroline Ngala Smith, who has a piece of work called Counting Dead Women and is published on the femicide census. She released her findings in 2016 and found that 76% were happening on separation, with 34% of them in the first month of separation. And that tells us, Rachel, doesn't it? There's a time window when professionals should be working smarter and together with organisations like Paladin, particularly within the first 4 months. And when we know that 34% of them were in the first month, that gives us a very clear steer of when the most dangerous time is.
Yeah. But what I see is professionals not only failing to help, but actually making the situation a whole lot worse. I deal with domestic abuse and coercive control cases, and if the woman has children, quite often, if she has reported the abuse to the police, then they will refer the case to social services, who will come along and say to the woman, okay, there's abuse happening here. You need to get rid of this guy. You need to tell him to leave the house. So this very dangerous perpetrator in many cases, we aren't going to do anything to help you. We aren't going to speak to him. We expect you to do this on your own. And by the way, if you let him back in or even perhaps see the children, then we are going to punish you further by removing the children from your care. And quite often I think this puts horrendous pressure on a woman who is trying to manage her own risk, because it might sound bizarre, but you are actually safer often within that abusive relationship, where you are keeping a lid on things and managing the perpetrator to some extent. And it's actually when you leave and they realise they've lost control that the behaviour escalates and women are murdered. And I think professionals, again, are missing that point and are putting women and children at risk in the attitudes and the expectations that they have.
And, you're talking about loss of control, but it's actually about them taking control, right?
Of the situation again, yeah. When they feel that they are losing the control that they had previously, they have to up the ante to get back control in their own eyes. And the ultimate act of control, as you have always said, is homicide, is murder.
And that's such an important point, the finality aspect, as Rachel said, and that finality is overlooked, along with a sense of entitlement and last resort thinking and a revenge motive. These are the most dangerous of cases, and yet routinely they are missed. And, perhaps we can say a little bit about Justine Rees as well, because there were, in Justine's case, she committed suicide because of the abusive behaviour, both the coercive control and when she's separated from him, the stalking campaign then begins, and he made her life so miserable. The war of attrition, as I call it, became so great that she took her own life. But this case is actually a legal first, isn't it? In terms of him initially being charged for coercive control and stalking, and bringing the lawyers, the Crown Prosecution Service, later bringing a charge of unlawful killing against the perpetrator after an inquiry into her death. Can you tell us a little bit about Justine's case and just the legal aspect around that?
Well, it's, as you say, it's the first case of its time, of its kind, where a perpetrator has been held to account for effectively forcing a victim to feel as though they have no other option, no other way out of this situation but to take their own life. And when we think about the way that domestic abuse will affect somebody emotionally and their confidence and mental health, and then that will be compounded by separating. So you think, okay, I've separated from this perpetrator, things are going to get easier, but the stalking starts. And that grinds you down further, and perhaps you ring the police and the police don't help you. And we've been talking about many cases where the police not only don't help you, but perhaps even threaten to prosecute you. And in those types of situations, you can easily see why women may feel that there is no other way out other than to take their own lives. And it's estimated that 3 women a week kill themselves because of domestic abuse. So this is a very common thing that happens. That's in addition to the 2 women a week that are murdered by ex-partners. So, the body's just really starting to add up. And it's high time that men were brought to account for this type of behaviour. And this case was the first of its kind. And I hope that there will be many more, because, it was, to all intents and purposes, murder.
Well, it is a very interesting case and a very sad case. she was 46 at the time. She was found hanged in her home in February after leaving a note saying that she had run out of fight following 6 months of threats from him. So that's 6 months of threats, and we know that the 1 in 2 who make a threat will act on it. She had set up home with him. They'd had a brief relationship after she met him at a scooter club convention in 2015. But within months, his behaviour changed and he became obsessive and controlling. And she actually left and she went into a women's refuge in 2016. And that's when, her friends and family said that he started stalking them, that 5 people close to her he was stalking and harassing in an attempt to try and track her down.
Yeah.
Now, he was a former soldier and a mechanic of no fixed abode. He made in excess of 3,500 attempts to contact Justine after they split in October.
Yeah.
And he made and sent thousands of calls and texts and messages via Facebook and WhatsApp to both Justine and her family members. And he'd also visit their homes. He threatened Justine's son. He posted offensive photographs of her mother's grave online. He also contacted employers and on one occasion falsely accused a family member of serious sexual offences.
Yeah.
Now, if that's not enough...
What is, yeah.
Well, he also had previous convictions for offences committed against other women going back to December 1998, and they included making threats to kill, headbutting a former partner and breaking her nose, and a threat to set fire to another victim's father's house who he was stalking.
Yeah. Very, very dangerous. Completely terrorised that woman for a long time. And when you read it back, he attacked every single thing in her life that was dear to her. Her job, her child, even her mum's grave. So, he attacked her on every level that was possible. So it's no surprise that she felt the only way out was to take her own life. And, the prosecution was correct.
And I think that's an important point you just made. He attacked and targeted all the significant things in her life, the things that mattered the most to her.
Yeah.
And that's what we see time and time again. And you can't tell me there wasn't evidence in all those behaviours and all those crimes and all that history of him doing this to other women. And that's what we see, the serial perpetration, don't we? Over and over again. So why isn't that taken seriously when, is it the fact that police are just not looking on the intelligence databases and they're just not joining this up? Because here's a serial perpetrator who seems to be operating with impunity and he's not being held to account. And then she kills herself and then thereafter he's held to account, but she's already dead.
Yeah, but it's too late, isn't it? And in my view, it shouldn't have just been him prosecuted for that, but it also should have been the professionals. They should have been prosecuted for their failings, almost in the way that we have corporate manslaughter. If your negligence causes somebody to lose their own life, then perhaps they should have been prosecuted. And I think one of the problems in the UK historically has been that it's almost impossible to be able to sue the police because they are protected, and it's very, very difficult to do that. There's been a case fairly recently, the War Boys case, where that's a chink has been broken through the armour of the police in that. In that case, there was a ruling that actually victims can sue the police for damages in respect of the failings in that case. Now, it's early days because that's a very recent case, but what we are looking at is how wide that will go and how that applies to other victims who have been failed by the police, because as we've been hearing, this is very common that the police will fail victims, and this is the result. Either the victim is murdered or the victim takes their own life, and there are dozens and dozens of opportunities prior to that for the police to do something.
And that's why, stalking is a serious psychological crime, the same as coercive control. It has a serious psychological impact. irrespective of any physical damage. And Nicholas Allen, the perpetrator who forced Justine Rees to take her own life, he received a 15-year extended sentence, which includes an extra 5-year period on licence. And the judge, Michael Chambers QC, said that Allen's disturbing conduct had been truly appalling. And he actually told Nicholas Allen, "You clearly caused her to lose her life, and before that to experience over a protracted period of time what must have been a living nightmare. It is not suggested that you intended at any time that she should die, but clearly you intended that she should suffer serious psychological harm. She committed suicide as a direct result of your sustained and determined criminal actions which you clearly knew were having a profound effect upon her." And interestingly, after she killed herself, Nicholas Allen conducted an internet search to establish whether he could be legally responsible for her death. So he fully well knew.
Of course, that he was responsible for it.
Yeah, and you embark on that behaviour, then it is going to have a serious impact. And what was interesting, I'll just read you the comment from the senior Crown prosecutor for West Midlands, Hannah Sidaway, said, "This was an exceptional case. Allen subjected Justine and those close to her to a sustained campaign of torment until she was unable to endure his behaviour any longer. There is no doubt he ultimately caused her to take her own life." I mean, do you think this is an exceptional case?
No, I think, as I say, 3 women a week are estimated to take their own life due to domestic abuse and coercive control. So I think it's the tip of the iceberg, to be quite honest.
And so there's some of the things that we have to keep challenging. You have a senior Crown prosecutor saying it's exceptional when this is what we see day in, day out, and the statistics don't always reflect, if we don't count how many suicides or attempt suicides there are. There's another case that was in the media, in the Telegraph, Rachel, which I'll just make mention of, which is of Natalie Lewis Hoyle, who was found hung she had taken her own life in her bedroom. Now, interestingly, this is the daughter of Sir Lindsay Hoyle, who is a Labour MP for Chorley in Lancashire, so from your neck of the woods.
Yep.
The way that the coroner describes the case, while the coroner said that she was in a somewhat troubled relationship, a very toxic relationship, and her mother also turned around and quoted within the same article saying that when somebody is in psychological torment, you don't get the bruises and the fat lips and the black eyes. Well, reading between the lines.
I mean, that sounds like domestic abuse, coercive control. And unfortunately, this crime isn't named very often in the press, and we hear things like that, troubled relationships, rather than naming it for what it is. And I think it's actually really important. And, you know, sometimes there can be legal reasons as to why things aren't said. But, you know, if we are talking about domestic abuse, then we should say it. And actually, I think it's quite dangerous to call things troubled relationships. It actually minimises what's happened. And if it's domestic abuse, then we've got a perpetrator and we've got a victim, and it needs to be described as that. It drives me mad when I read stalking cases, and they're clearly stalking cases, and the perpetrator will be described as spurned lover or something like that, so that we feel sorry for him.
Or lovesick.
It's
the most recent one.
Exactly. And it's actually really offensive to the victim. And again, it minimises the behaviour and makes us feel sorry for the perpetrator and almost demonises the victim for reporting it. And it's completely wrong. And it's one of the reasons, I think, that stalking isn't taken seriously. It's just this way that we describe it in the media.
Absolutely. I mean, those euphemisms, tumultuous, volatile, troubled, and we do need to move away from that and actually be on the nose and name it for what it is.
Yeah.
And if coercive control is happening, the drip, drip, drip behaviours, the insidious behaviours where the rules are laid down and victims are being micromanaged, and there's such sort of psychological torment, we need to be able to talk about it and identify it and make it clear to people what we're talking about. And there's very clear guidance, the statutory framework guidance from 2015 that people can look to. We'll put it in the show notes. I'm not just saying it's good guidance because I helped write it. It is very detailed, much more so than the Stalking Home Office circular. And the other two points to reference as well is one about serial perpetrators. Please do sign the Paladin petition that John Clough and Zoe Dronfield and Rachel and I are pushing. We're trying to get to 150,000 signatures because, as you keep hearing, these perpetrators are serial. And within Her Majesty's Inspectorate, within that report, there's a section on offender management, and it basically says on page 77 that there's a substantial number of potentially dangerous people who are not being managed under any recognised offender management process. And that is the nub of the issue, that we are lobbying government, and there is the domestic violence bill that's out for consultation. I believe it ends on May the 30th. There's a section in there on offender management. It's a really important consultation, and unfortunately, whilst people are talking and there's consultation going on and on and on, it means that women and girls are still being murdered and suicides are still happening, sadly. But please do look at that. And the other thing that I just want to leave our listeners with is an acronym for if you are being stalked, which is REPORT, and the R stands for report it as stalking. So use that word stalking. Tell the police what's happening to you. Also tell people around you. Tell your family, tell your partner, tell your friends, tell your workplace what's happening, so that that perpetrator cannot maneuver into those spaces or get into those places and make you unsafe. Evidence, the E, collect the evidence and screenshot things, keep things, because if you do not, nobody else will, sadly. So make sure that you keep and collect the evidence. The P stands for get good practical advice, and practical advice from services like Paladin, or you can go on the website. The O is for keep an overview, a diary, and that diary, you can download the template off the Paladin website. The R stands for risk, the 12 questions on the risk checklist. Please look at those questions. They're on the DASH checklist, they're on Paladin's website, and ask yourself, or if you're a brother or a sister or a best friend or a partner, ask the person who's being stalked those questions and take it with you when you report it to the police. And the T, which is very important, is to trust your instinct. And if you feel unsafe and if you believe you're at risk, follow your instinct, because 9 times out of 10, when I've sadly been privy to and party to domestic homicide reviews or a murder review, 9 times out of 10, the victim knew they were going to be killed. They told professionals they were going to be killed, and then they were. So you are the expert in your own situation, and this is where Paladin, the advocates, the specialist independent stalking advocacy caseworkers are just crucial to have somebody to be your voice, or the likes of Rachel, who are doing fantastic work at the front end of keeping victims safe, having somebody else who can advocate for you because of that war of attrition. It's exhausting enough when you're being stalked, let alone when you're having to battle the system and the people within it to have them hear your voice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really good advice.
Is there anything else, Rachel, that you would advise, victims or our listeners, or anything else that you want to add before you rush off, or we rush off to the House of Lords to talk about this very important subject of stalking in a very important place where people can make a difference to the investment of services like Paladin and get behind the cause, which is why we're going to be going up there?
I think just to say to victims or people that know a victim, don't give up, because it is soul destroying when you just think nobody is listening. There are people out there like Paladin that will listen, that will take it seriously and will validate your experience, because, if you keep being rebuffed by the criminal justice system, it does wear you down. But keep reporting it, and eventually, with assistance, you will get justice, is my belief.
So name it as stalking?
Absolutely name it as stalking, because if you don't, there's no guarantee that the professional, in inverted commas, will actually get it We are working really hard to train more and more people about what stalking is, because we're not talking about training people about what the law is. That's fairly easy to look up and to reference, but you can read that. But if you don't understand what stalking actually is, then you're not going to even think about looking at that act. So it is really important that we continue to get that message out, whether it be by training professionals or through the media work that we do constantly. And eventually, I do believe we will make a difference. It just seems like a very steep hill sometimes.
It is. It's pushing a boulder up a hill, but we're determined. That's why we do it. And, you know, Jim and I are working hard as well on TV shows and the opportunities to go on, you know, news channels, etc., and talk about stalking. And it's really important that we do thread it into storylines and that it is name-checked. And, you know, of course, Murdered by My Boyfriend was about the case of Casey Brittle up in Nottingham. And I was in Nottingham at the end of last week when I flew over from LA training probation, because they had a number of high-profile cases there. And we talked about Casey Brittle in the training room. And yes, it was a great drama on the Casey Brittle case. But and I highly commend our listeners to Google it and watch it online. But at no point did they name the word stalking. And although you got the sense of her being closed down in terms of being called constantly and him turning up at her home address and at her workplace and just in every space and in her face, unfortunately they didn't call it what it is, and we need to name it. It is a serious crime. It's not funny, it's not romantic, it's insidious, and it's terrifying when it happens to you. So next when you hear someone joke about it or crack a joke, challenge them. Be part of the change that we're trying to ensure happens. And, you know, a great accolade to the work that we're doing. I was talking to someone just this morning, earlier before meeting with Rachel, and she said to me, it's quite amazing. It seems that there's a lot more awareness now of stalking and coercive control, certainly over the last few years. And I said, yeah, we've been working really hard to ensure that people understand what it is. And that's why it's so important to have National Stalking Awareness Week. So
I think, you know, you've been quite modest there, Laura, because we wouldn't have either the stalking law or the coercive control law if it wasn't for you and your campaigning. So on behalf of all victims, I would like to say thank you.
Well, thank you, Rachel. That's, you know, a lovely gesture, and I certainly couldn't do any of these things on my own. And working with some fantastic professionals like you and the rest of the Paladin board and other professionals from other charities, and of course working with victims, the very people who this impacts upon, and having their voice at the centre of everything I do and we do to drive change has been really important. So we're going to continue to push that boulder up the hill. There's plenty more work for us to do. And, you know, to those who are experiencing stalking or coercive control and domestic abuse, please don't suffer in silence. It's a really important thing that we don't allow people to be isolated down and rendered more vulnerable and feel so psychologically alone that people feel there's no other option but to take their own life. There is help out there. So go on the Paladin website, pick up the phone, make that call. And we thank our listeners very much for listening and being part of the change. So for now, this is Real Crime Profile signing off.
If you like our podcasts, there are a few things you can do. You can take 2 minutes and go to Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review. You can also check out all Real Crime Profile offers and promotions and our sponsors in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go to Facebook and like our Facebook page, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Real Crime Profile without the E. And one last thing, please tell your friends, family and colleagues about us and spread the Real Crime Profile word. Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate all of our listeners.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan. Sound engineering by Mike Thal. Music is composed by Simba Tsumba. Logo art by Jim Clementi. Real Crime Profile is produced by XG Productions and distributed by Wondery.
For advice and support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0203 866 4107, or you can go to the website where there's a lot of information and advice that you can follow on www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic abuse, you can call the National Domestic Violence Helpline for free on 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, shelter or counselling, you can call Genesis, the 24-hour hotline, on 214-946-4357. You can also go to their website for further advice or support, www.genesisshelter.org. And there's the domestic violence hotline on 800 799 7233.